Okay, so the first thing just to say is we're in a series of 3, and the first thing was about what kind of a teacher was Jesus, and we went through a number of things: style, focus of content, and then also different sorts of sayings, and then sayings and actions together. And what I want to do now is talk about Jesus, the kingdom, and the poor. So we're going to talk about an aspect of Jesus' teaching. We're going to talk about what he says, but we're also going to talk about some of his actions at the same time to talk about this notion of the kingdom. And we're going to talk about his understanding of the poor and the place of the poor. And we're also going to talk about different literary forms. So there are going to be some beatitudes. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven, or kingdom of God. And there are also going to be parables involved here and other sorts of things. So we're going to see, maybe not the full range of all the different sorts of sayings and activities, but we're going to see a range of them together to talk about Jesus, the kingdom, and the poor. I want to do that also a little bit in the context of some contemporary issues and questions, though, you know, it's not, I can't give a full accounting of that. I want to just start by talking about the last presidential campaign a little bit in terms of some statistics from 2011, which are closer on for that campaign. The number of people in the U.S. living below the poverty line, estimated by a number of scholars, in 2011 was 46.2 million, which was the highest in more than 50 years that the records had been kept. If you go to 2011 and you subtract 50 years, you end up just a few years before Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, and about 7 years before Martin Luther King Jr. goes to Memphis in a Poor People's Campaign and gets assassinated in the middle of his Poor People's Campaign. The candidate's rhetoric in the last election, from the point of view of the question of poverty, was, how shall we say, not optimal. That is, there was comparatively little attention paid to poverty and poverty-related issues in that campaign. The candidate's rhetoric pointed to an answer as to why so little attention was paid. It seemed, at least in that election, I don't know what will happen next, that the middle class and the job creators had fused to become the holy grail of American politics. And everything in economic policy was about them, middle class and job creators and stuff like that. I'm not against that. I think there is a middle class, and I think you do have to create jobs. You can't distribute what you haven't produced. I think it's basic stuff. But on the other hand, the poor are not the middle class, and they're not the job creators either. So if you want to talk about it, you have to talk about something more than that. In an age, I think, in the age of the pollster and electronic communications, there was a good chance that the candidates were more or less saying what many Americans wanted to hear. That they didn't sculpt the messages all on their own. When poverty came up at all, it was usually at the edges of the campaign. Romney's comments about the safety net and 47% and so on and so forth like that. Obama's claim to help people into the middle class via student loans and so forth. And those comments were there. And there's also the question of creating jobs and so forth and helping an economy. But I think overall, in a Christian perspective, even a brief look at the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament is enough to indicate that that discussion or lack of discussion of the question of poverty in the 2012 presidential campaign was a poor showing. You know, it wasn't really a great time out in the annals of that sort of thing. Before we turn to Jesus, let me say a couple of things, and they're listed on your sheet, that we want to keep in mind about the teaching of Jesus in the New Testament. They're a little bit like some of the things we mentioned before. Interpreters often domesticate Jesus so that he fits their own preferences and is unable to accuse or challenge those who look to him for guidance. This is a kind of typical thing in the history of Jesus scholarship and also Jesus interpretations. I'll mention in my sermon tomorrow that a man named Bruce Barton wrote a book called The Man Who Nobody Knows in the 1920s. Is basically Jesus as Henry Ford. Claimed that Jesus picked 12 men from the bottom rungs of business and forged an organization that could conquer the world. Only in America, okay? I mean, that's a particularly American point of view. So far as we know, it's not the temptation of people in Ecuador to look at Jesus in quite that way. And he's not the only one. In the 1990s, a woman named Lori Beth Jones wrote a couple of books. One's called Jesus CEO, and the other one called Jesus in Blue Jeans. But the basic point was that Jesus had great wisdom for management of business, and this time as a boutique entrepreneur, not as Henry Ford, see, like that. So this is a kind of recurrent thing in American Protestantism, but there's an equivalent also in scholarly work on Jesus that very often people see a reflection of themselves or what they want to see. And it's a kind of a difficult dynamic in Jesus research. So we're going to try and mitigate that. I don't think we can completely avoid that. And we want to keep in mind that sometimes when interpreters domesticate Jesus, they get the Jesus that they want, but they may not get they may run over some of the parts of the Jesus who's there. And we want to try and engineer a little bit of a confrontation part of the time. To do that, we have to let Jesus be a little bit of a pain in the neck. And that's what we have to do. The Gospels, second, offer theological reflections about Jesus, and they don't give us unfiltered access to the Jesus of history. This is the point about the Gospels being written preaching, having a kind of religious function and a theological content. They're not really, the attempt was not to get a bunch of historians in white coats and dust everything and reconstruct things in a highly critical way. That's not what they were doing. It may be that some people in the modern period would have preferred it if that's what the gospel writers had done, but that is not what they had done. The modern historian dusting for things and doing it, that's a modern phenomenon over here. It's not what they're up to. They care about a religious community of followers and a religious message, and they want to interpret Jesus for that community. That's what they're doing. And I'm sure that if we could get them here, something they say, and what else would you have me do? I mean, that's what they wanted to do, and it's what they did. So that's another thing. The third thing is that Jesus is not the whole of Christian ethics. We want to keep this in mind. There's more to Christian ethics than just Jesus. Now, it's easy to tell this. When you say the Apostles' Creed, and you start off saying, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, you're talking about God's reign or governance in the world. And that also has something to do with ethics. So when you go to something like the Ten Commandments, and it tells you do not kill, right? Sometimes translated as do not murder, interpreted, and there's a whole big interpretive issue there. We're not going to worry about that at the moment. What did Martin Luther? Martin Luther said, even the Turk knows that you shouldn't kill. Now, when Martin Luther said something like that, he didn't mean he wanted to be as part of a religious organization that talked with everybody. Martin Luther, not that kind of a guy. Martin Luther meant that if even the Turk knows, then everybody knows. It's sort of like saying, I don't know, even Abbott and Costello know, something like that. And what he means by that is that to understand that you shouldn't murder people, you don't have to be a Jew or a Christian. That's a generally distributed little bit of moral wisdom in the world. And it fits with what the requirements are for human communities to flourish and to get along and to do business. You can't go around killing people all the time. If you do, everything just kind of collapses, right? In the good old city of Richmond, where I used to live for a while, we used to have we used to have a high murder rate, right? I mean, we didn't kill as many people as they did, like in Chicago, but pound for pound, we killed more of them. And I also thought it meant we were probably a little tougher, or something, or we're a little more skewed. Now, at the height of that stuff in Richmond was a city of about 210,000 at that point or something. You could have like 200 people a year maybe get murdered in Richmond or something like that, maybe 150. If you can do the math, it's high, but it's not like 10%. If you've killed 10% of the people, no one would go anywhere. So Martin Luther's remark, which is not optimally stated, that even the Turk knows, makes a point, and that is that the part of Christian ethics is general things that you can discern by reflecting on God's world in light of religious traditions and so forth, and it's not always and only about the teaching of Jesus. Okay. That's helpful. And you can talk about justice and fairness at points without necessarily centering everything on Jesus, though Jesus has some things to say about that. So that's the next thing, is that Jesus is not the whole of Christian ethics. And then another little caution is that moral ideas and commitments do not translate directly into current policies. This is something I always like to remind my liberal friends of, and most of my friends are. So let's say I want to change things and make them fair and have a better distribution of goods through an economy or a social system. There is the small question of what might work to accomplish that. Simply saying I'm for that doesn't immediately tell me what's the best way to do it. And so you can have some people whose understanding of the way that economics work in a society is just fundamentally different than yours. So that you can share a value and still differ on policy. That's entirely possible to do. And there are, and I used to have good friends in Richmond who I would characterize probably as moderate Republicans who wanted to see strategies to work that way and would talk about it in some detail that weren't exactly like the strategies that some of the more liberal Democrats would prefer. The disagreement was not primarily over whether or not it was important to help the poor. The disagreement was over how does an economy work and what might best accomplish that goal. Boy, you get back to that place, be in great shape in some ways. So you don't get a policy directly out of the teaching of Jesus about a value. Okay, well, as we said before, Jesus says and does a lot of things in the New Testament. He talks about divorce in a number of places. He heals the sick and casts out demons. He teaches people and disciples to love enemies. And he teaches them where and how to pray and to fast. He sends them out to villages and towns. He teaches about Caesar and paying taxes, trusting God rather than being anxious, and so forth. But as I said, one of the things I want to claim is that a lot of his teaching is especially concerned with the kingdom of God. So we talked about the parable of the mustard seed, which now makes an appearance on the back of your sheet here, or at least it's supposed to. Is it there? Bottom of the front. Thank you. And again, just to review two possible interpretations, and surely there are more. One is that the kingdom is like a really great investment that pays off big time, and another one is the kingdom is disruptive. So when we talk about Jesus' teaching about the kingdom and the poor, we may find that when he talks about the kingdom, at points the kingdom is a bit disruptive. It involves reversals and challenges current circumstances in ways that maybe sometimes people forget. It looks like an aspect of what he's doing in the New Testament. The parable of the workers in the vineyard in Matthew 20, which I think also makes an appearance here. We don't need to read the whole thing, but you can see it, and it's a famous and wonderful parable. This thing has sometimes been interpreted as if what's going on is we're talking about Jews going out first and Christians going out last and getting the same thing. It's a possible interpretation of the parable, and remember, the parables can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. A number of historians, however, think that this parable also goes back to the historical Jesus. And if that's true, then there needs to be at least one other possible interpretation of the parable, because Jesus doesn't have a Christian community. Jesus is running a group of people that follow Jesus within Judaism. That's all. And sometimes that gets lost, and the later texts of the Gospels give you the impression that there's Christians and Jews, but it's not really the case. So if that's right, then this isn't really about Christians and Jews, or at least one interpretation is, it's about a kingdom that disrupts and reverses then current and ordinary business practice. No one goes out and hires people like this and pay them all the same wage for going out there and working different times. And the guys that go out there for an hour, you give them the same, give them a full daily wage? No, don't do that. You figure out how long they worked and you pay them fairly, and so something's up here. And that may also...
Nobody's going to take the job at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right, second, that's right. Second day, they're all going to wait till 5 p.m. So it's an odd practice, and that's one of the things you want to keep in mind. That's right. We also have the contrast, a reversal theme in Luke 5:27 and so forth that we talked about, and that's where Jesus is eating and drinking with all the wrong people. Well, what's going on there is that's not the way you're supposed to run banquets and have dinner parties. You're supposed to have dinner parties in the ancient world. It's not that different from the contemporary world. In some ways it's very different, but you go to my house and you see us having a dinner party, it's likely to be a bunch of professors over there. It's okay, it's interesting to me, but it is a little limiting. Right? You're probably not going to see a professor and a sanitation worker and a farmer and all that in my house. I mean, I don't even think I know any sanitation worker by name. It's probably my own fault, but okay. Same thing in the good old ancient world, right? And so when you eat and drink with all the wrong people, when you're willing to go to a Roman centurion's house to heal a servant, now that means you're going to heal the servant of an occupying officer. Just scroll back to one of those old Bogart movies and see how everyone's feeling about that in occupied France. They just probably as soon blow his head off. Okay, so that's one. And now you're going to also eat with tax collectors and sinners, and you're going to... What's going on here? It reverses ordinary banquet practice, and it kind of needles things a little bit. Maybe Ottati's wrong just to always be eating with the people who are just like him all the time. See, that's not really quite the kingdom. See? Okay, so we have that too. Now, we do have also some teachings here that have to do with the kingdom, having to do with the law and the prophets, and that's of some importance to look at also. And we've got that on here. When the prophets talk about the law and they talk about the kingdom, they relate them a lot. And we can see that by looking at the Amos passage first and then the Exodus passage second on the back of your sheet. Amos, the Israelites, hate the one who reproves in the gate. Someone in the gate is right down in the center of town and is giving everyone a hard time, is reproving things, and they don't like it. That's what prophets do. They show up in the center of town and start jumping up and dancing. Right? They abhor the one who speaks the truth. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions, and how great are your sins, you who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe and push aside the needy in the gate. Therefore the prudent will keep silent in such a time, for it is an evil time. Now, why is Amos concentrating on questions of how the poor are being treated? When he does that, he's part of a long tradition in Hebrew scriptures. And it goes all the way back to the initial articulations of the law. It also includes the sense that persons who are comfortable in positions of power are less likely to simply run over the interests of other persons who are comfortable in power, because those other persons are in a position to resist. and to represent their own interests. But there are groups of people who don't have as much power, and they're not in such a good position to resist when that happens. And typically, in the good old Hebrew scriptures, they are the poor, widows, orphans, and the stranger or the immigrant within your gates. They do not have the resources and the connections to represent their own interests in the same way. So if we're going to treat someone in ways that we prefer ourselves not to be treated, the likely candidates are, and here comes the list, like the widow, orphan, the poor, the stranger within the gate. Now we can go to Exodus to see how this comes up here in Exodus 22, and then we can also go to Exodus 23. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Now this is a point that has to do both with a sort of general point that Luther might have said anyone can tell, that when you're a resident alien somewhere, you don't have the connections, you don't have the standing, so you're more likely to be abused and taken advantage of. But also includes the experience of Israel itself as aliens and slaves in the land of Egypt without resources to stand up to these other powers. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. It's pretty direct. And you can see, again, it's this typical Hebrew thing where it's addressed to the men. You see that on the thing. But it is, okay, you treat widows and orphans badly. Okay, your people become widows and orphans. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. In what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. So you can lend money at interest sometimes, but not to the poor. It turns out when Calvin approves of interest in his own time and place, you still can't charge interest to the poor as far as he's concerned. So there's a kind of difference there. It's just interesting as it goes through. So we have that kind of aspect to the teachings of Jesus. We've got some other things. We've got blessings or beatitudes. And here we're looking at Luke 6:20 and 21, and then Luke 6:24 to 25, and we can compare it to what you have in Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. It's kind of interesting. But in Luke 6:20 to 21, we have, then he looked up at his disciples and said, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Now in Matthew, those are spiritualized somewhat. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and so forth. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. There's overlap between these two different ways of saying it. That is, persons who are actually without means are also humble. And if you take the word humble, like in a Dickens novel, or in a PBS British thing, or even just look it up in the dictionary, those who are humble can be of humble resources and also humble in terms of humility. There's overlap there, but the statements are not exactly alike. I don't know what to say there. I mean, should we all decide that we like Matthew better than Luke or Luke better than Matthew? Possibly what we better decide is that they're both there. And we're going to need to give them their due. There are some scholars who believe, a number of them, that the statement in Luke is probably closer to the lips of Jesus than the statement in Matthew. That may be. It would accord with some other things. But in any case, both are there. And right now, we'll just stick with the one from Luke. And then a few verses later, we get the curses, that come later. So it's blessed are you, and then we get, but woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Well, so you have there a beatitude that expresses an alternative kind of a reality that sits uneasily in relation to current social reality, and that involves a kind of a reversal, in some ways. And you can see that being said here. These are not, of course, the only things that are said. Now, we've got some other sorts of things to say about Jesus' message in this regard, but let's for the moment just recall that when Jesus talks about the kingdom, that looks like near the core of his message. So we can't say that his teaching about the poor is itself the core of his message, but we can say that it's related to the core. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Okay. Once you relate it to the kingdom of God, we're into something pretty fundamental as far as Jesus is concerned. So the sum total of Jesus' teaching is not simply teaching about the poor. There are other things, but the teaching about the poor is very closely related to what looks like to be the central theme of his teaching. So it's not just a sort of an aside or something. Well, we can go further here and talk about some of these things. We recall again that the kingdom is the part of Jesus' preaching right at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. And so we can see that it's an important matter. We can also look at Mark 10:24-27, which is what I think of as, it's a kind of a grace passage in a way. And we're going to talk about that. It'll be fun. It's right there on the back. And the disciples were perplexed at these words, but Jesus said to them again, children, how hard it is. This is after he asked someone to sell all they have and give to the poor, and they don't want to do it, and they go away heavy-hearted. Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom. They were greatly astounded and said to one another, then who can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said, for mortals it is impossible, but not for God. For God all things are possible. Now the grace end. For God all things are possible, and the rich can also enter the kingdom. It's a little tough to get a camel through an eye of a needle. True. But for God all things are possible. But you notice, God doesn't have to work overtime to get the poor in there, right? God's working overtime to get the camel through the needle. Is what's going on here. God can do it. All things are possible for God. So it's a grace passage, kinda. It's a grace passage that also gives you a little bit of a tough time. And it's an interesting passage. It's not the only sort of thing you have here. And what you'll see also in the New Testament is the claim that riches and wealth are sometimes problematic because you can get so attentive to them that you forget other things. And the relationship to God and neighbor becomes skewed because of too much attention to riches and wealth. So there's always a potential downside to wealth in this sense. Okay, this is the kind of thing that we see in the New Testament here with Jesus. These points then finally relate a little bit to the golden rule, which you have in Matthew 7:12, and it was also here on your sheet, and it's short and to the point. In everything do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Now, this is called the golden rule. And here Jesus says it's a summary of the law and the prophets, and also it also means that you need to understand it in relation to the law and the prophets, which is a good thing because the golden rule has its shortcomings, right? So if in everything I do to others as I would have them do to me, and I'm some sort of a sociopath or psychic. Now we have the fixings for an Alfred Hitchcock movie, not for great morality, and so there are some holes here in the golden rule, but you can supplement it with the whole law and the prophets, which ought to straighten you out there a little bit. Now the other thing that's true is that the golden rule is a very generally distributed thing. In Jesus' own time, Rabbi Hillel is going to affirm it. There's a negative version earlier in the book of Tobit, way earlier than it's a gleam in the eye of anyone in biblical times. It's being taught by Confucius in one form or another, Mencius, one of his associates, and so forth. It shows up in a lot of Western philosophy. So, John Stuart Mill at one point thought it was the summary of the greatest good for the greatest number, which for him was the cat's pajamas in terms of morality, because that was rule of utility. Immanuel Kant, at least early on, thinks it's the categorical imperative almost, and because it refuses exceptions on the basis of your own interest and your own conduct. And the idea is people go around doing that a lot, see. You can give them a universalizable moral rule, treat everyone as ends and not as means only. But if I really want something, maybe I could treat you as a means. You know what I mean? If I really want it, and that's the kind of thing you got to look out for. So Kant thinks it's a big deal. The Baha'i also has something like this in it. It's like, and if you can read some books that'll claim that in almost every culture and religious tradition can affirm something like the Golden Rule positively or negatively as a pretty good snap check to see whether you're being fair. And not only that, at my house years ago, when the Judsons used to live further east and so forth, there was a then popular phrase in our house where Katie would say, "But Daddy, Albert did it to me first." And that really is the Golden Rule again in a negative sense. Before that, in New Jersey, while I'm coming up in New Jersey, we had such, clever people in New Jersey when I was growing up. You have the line, "Do unto others as they would do unto you, but do it first." Ha ha ha. So, which is a kind of the tribute that vice pays to virtue or something, right? And in any case, it's a very generally distributed thing. Generally distributed because the idea is that people tend to let their own private interest, their own personal, overrun a little bit fairness to others. And this is a way would they like to be treated that way themselves? That's a good initial test, you see. And so we can talk about people, the widow, the poor, the orphan, and the stranger within the gates as good test cases because they're likely sometimes to be candidates for being treated by a society in ways other than many people would like to be treated because they can't really object too much and strenuously. And so we might say the Golden Rule makes a pretty good test for whether or not a society is just and how a society treats, trot out the list again, the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the resident alien or stranger within the gate is not a bad initial test of whether it's being kind of just or it's a little skewed or something like that. And I think, by and large, Bible's going to be with you on that. I mean, in fact, in the Hebrew scriptures, I think you'd have to say in the final analysis that, as this is Walter Brueggemann now saying this, not me, but I think he's right, that in the Hebrew scriptures there is a kind of special attention to the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger within your gates, and there's a kind of a redistributive aspect to justice. You don't just get to earn all the money and take it and run. And that's there. And the supposition of the Hebrew scriptures, most of the time, though there are questions also, you're not supposed to favor the poor in a lawsuit. The lawsuit, you want to be absolutely fair and just. See? Now, the suspicion is very often that the poor are not going to fare well in a lawsuit for some of the same reasons that they sometimes don't fare well in lawsuits today. I mean, who can afford what to go to court and all that kind of great. But the idea is you want to do that. But the claim is then that by and large, the poor are sooner or later being taken advantage of by other powers. That's basically a predominant biblical view, Now, whether it's right or wrong, I'd be exegetically lying to you if I said something else. Doesn't mean that they're wrong. It may be that, it may be that some of the most extreme laissez-faire capitalist things are actually correct, but they're just not in the Bible as well. It's what we're talking about now. Okay, so we got this. When you connect Jesus' teaching about the poor to the Golden Rule, part of what you're doing is connecting his teaching about the poor with a widely recognized rule of fairness. So Christians can have particular reasons looking at Jesus to care about the poor, but if you go ahead and work with something like the Golden Rule, maybe you can also make the public argument too. Who's most likely to get the short end of the stick here? Right? Is sort of the point, and you can generalize it a little bit that way. Golden Rule, general principle of fairness, not an entirely adequate one, as I said. It's got its holes in it, and then it's in relation to the law and the prophets. Okay, well, so we can just then return to a kind of a point, and that is that, again, at the present time, a record number of people in the U.S., according to a number of the sources, live in poverty, and reports indicate that, somewhere between 21 and 23% of children in the U.S. live in poverty. Now, you got to understand, what constitutes living in poverty is a contested thing. But how much money do you have to have? And the numbers are also contested. And I'm not here to, these are the ones that I get from a couple of different sources. They might not be entirely right. But I'm going to just assume they're in the ballpark somewhere, huh? And that this is the sort of things people are talking about. The World Bank estimates that 1.29 billion people live on less than $1.25 per day, and that 2.47 billion live on less than $2 per day. Numbers that, while they are disturbingly high, also show recent declines. There has been some progress, according to the World Bank, in terms of poverty worldwide. It's not as bad by their measures as it was some decades ago. So that's an interesting thing. The World Hunger Education Service says 925 million people were hungry in 2010, or 13.1% of the world's population. So it looks like it's a pretty major problem, but also sometimes you can make some headway on it, and so forth. And there are disagreements over some of the numbers. A number of studies indicate that very many different factors are connected with poverty. One big one is war. So wars displace populations, and when they displace poor populations, then they migrate. Then those populations not only are not only poor, but they become strangers within the gates somewhere else with very few resources. And you can see that today in a number of different places in the world. Very often in some of the conflicts in Africa, you see that in a big way. And then the group is particularly susceptible to disease and starvation and this kind of thing. Agricultural practices and land use are related to questions of poverty, and so are the availability of medical care, emergency services, good water, and education. It looks like there's no single solution. And in fact, I think that's probably true. This is the sort of thing, again, we mentioned Washington and Lee University in a negative light last lecture. Let us now mention it in a positive light. There is something called the Shepherd Center at Washington and Lee, which is named for a donor named Shepherd. And it specializes in the study of poverty in Appalachia, which is right nearby, and sends students on internships there and study programs to try and figure this stuff out. So that's a pretty neat program, and a number of different colleges and universities participate with Washington and Lee in that program. They want to make a big deal out of multiple causes, and one of the things they'll point out is that in Appalachian locations, for example, you get more physicians in the area. But what you got to understand, and it's easy to understand it, and you could probably do it in places in Michigan too, you just drive around Appalachia. Sometimes people who are poor don't have the transportation to get to the doctor. That's just flat. And in public transportation in Appalachia, that's actually like a pipe dream. There is none, right? So if you don't have, how do you do it? So sometimes one way to help out people who are poor is simply by providing transportation to physicians that they either can pay for or some program will help them pay for, but otherwise they're not going to get there. So that's an interesting thing. And sometimes also transportation, of course, to food stores. And decent food stores, ones that have something in it that you could eat for a while and live and prosper, as opposed to some other stores in the world. So that kind of thing is also important. Sometimes as simple as transportation. We I used to have a neighbor across the street in Davidson. He lives a few blocks away now. And I don't know how he got his liver and everything in such bad shape. He's dialyzed twice a week, or 3 times a week or something. It's twice a week, I think. And if you count it up, if you got a day after or something, or maybe it's 3, he's not about to get a big job. Now, he goes out and tries to get jobs. He's also bipolar. And I don't know that I'd hire him right off the bat. I mean, in any case, he's in a tough spot, But one of the things that happens is that Church and Red Cross come by to give him transportation to places once in a while, which is good. And he's got a scooter, and he can get on the scooter with his helmet. And they think, someone better look out for him because it may not, but he rides it pretty well. But what he can't do with that scooter is he can't go up the highway to be dialyzed, and he can't drive himself back from dialysis on the scooter, And he also can't do a very good job at a grocery store on the scooter because, well, it's a scooter, man, and you just can't put that much stuff in there, see? So that kind of, and that's like a major help to this guy, a very, very nice man, so that's a good deal, huh? And then also when he had to move, the church figured out how to get people around. I'm sure your church do similar things since he was a member of the church because he's nearby, see? And figured out how to get people to help him move his furniture to the subsidized apartment where he's going in a few blocks away in town. And also to make sure that he had, it wasn't brand new, but they got him a TV set that was big enough so he could see what was going on because, he kind of likes to watch it, right? Okay, so that's good. And once in a while, you can take him to the store, get him a beer or two, because he is going to try and lead a life here, It's a little discretionary income, right? Okay. Now, the church isn't doing that, but they might with some profit do it. There's multiple causes of poverty so that when we get people, groups like the Gates Foundation want to talk about the variety of different things on which governments and different groups can have a significant impact, which in turn can have some impact on the quality of life of poorer people. People disagree about the statistics. Different poverty studies sometimes emphasize different contributing factors. And again, we want to say that there's more to a Christian social ethic than Jesus' vision of the kingdom. But if this picture is more or less somewhat accurate, then it's probably true that if we don't leave Jesus' message behind, then the last presidential campaign, it just wasn't that hot on this issue, And we got one coming up, see, which is also a kind of fun thing. So one question is, what will people ask their candidates to talk about? But what I'd like to suggest here is that maybe it's time for a different kind of a campaign. Churches can do a lot of different things. I've seen some lists of some of the things you all do here. Look, I said you all. My wife isn't even here to hear me say it. I'm from New Jersey. I say this about twice a year, you all. And it doesn't sound right when I do. But I saw some of the magnificent things you're doing here. But even if congregations and denominations cannot become a church of the poor, and depending on where they're located, that's implausible, right? I mean, I suppose you could try that here in Birmingham. You have to have a lot of bus transportation, I think. They can nevertheless ask how they can be more welcoming of the homeless and the impoverished. This is a question for a lot of different churches, and sometimes if you're at the Broad Street Mission in Philadelphia, it's a question of how to get different people in your worship service and your common meals, which Broad Street Mission does in Philadelphia. It's a real interesting thing. It's got, some sort of, relatively well-heeled lawyers and stuff, but they go to church right down there on Broad Street in Philly. It's not too far from the City Hall and all that, but it turns out, lucky for them in a way, right, there's a lot of homeless people around too, so you can try a certain thing there. But not everyone's located like Broad Street Church, and they're not gonna be. But that's one way of doing it. Individual congregations probably just need to ponder what sorts of programs and initiatives make sense in their particular circumstances. What sorts of joint committees and joint projects that are possible in different locations that help. And that's going to differ from place to place. But part of the answer is likely to be increased attention to and involvement with local conditions, because sometimes, as we all know, local conditions can be rendered invisible in some ways. Sometimes just by routine. I don't have a great reason to want to drive through a bunch of projects every day, on my way to the library or something. I mean, I can get to the library without getting in the car. Or when I used to live in Richmond, they put in a big expressway through Richmond, and they put these big walls around it, and it's down there, and well, heck, you can drive all the way through Richmond, and all you ever see is concrete. I mean, and you know what's going on the other side of those walls. I mean, and that's not the fault of the person driving the car. It means that it's possible for things to be rendered invisible. Where I live now in Davidson, North Carolina, go down Main Street. Well, it looks great and everything, but there are a fair number of poor people in Davidson, North Carolina, and unbeknownst, to a lot of us who are not going in different directions. So that's one thing. They can be rendered invisible from the vantage point of well-traveled routes and popular destinations and so forth for many of us. Poverty often is closer than many recognize, and particularly in comparatively prosperous suburban locations like Davidson, where I live, which is comparatively prosperous, but in fact there's poverty closer by than people think. Hands-on involvements are important when it comes to real services, transportation to and from grocery stores, doctors' offices, and also for helping people develop awareness of the human costs and the broader issues, and developing some awareness of the particular people involved. Nothing works better than actually hanging around a little bit with some people who are poor. That's a good thing. And those hands-on involvements, it may not change the whole world just by driving in a car, but it's helpful to somebody, and it's also helpful to the person who's doing the driving because they get to see a little bit more what's up, and that's kind of helpful too. Well, again, congregations and denominations need to become educated about and support poverty-related missions and initiatives in this country and abroad undertaken by religious and non-religious groups and institutions. And I think a lot of congregations do this. There is also the business of advocacy that would be a part of, a poor people's campaign that was located in churches, which, I'm thinking, there's a chance if you locate it in churches, it could be a tad more dependable than locating it with the big-time politicians. I'm not sure about that, but I have this inkling. I know it can be more dependable than locating it with the state legislature in the great state of North Carolina. You don't want to hand this over just to those guys. So advocacy is a part of it, and what this means is it includes critiques of prevalent social attitudes, injustices, and manipulations. You can consider a lot of things, like the distribution of educational opportunities in the U.S. is sometimes not optimal. I mean, sometimes it's real impressive, but sometimes it's not, And again, I just talk about Richmond, a city where I lived for 30 years. And if you go to East End, Richmond, there's a public school system there. It's the same as the one in the West End. It's a City of Richmond school. But the schools are not exactly alike. And who's going to them is not exactly alike. And the opportunity is not exactly alike. And there's been an effort to make it that way, but it's very much a work in progress if there is progress being made. So these are things to keep in mind that are related to questions of poverty. There's also the question of agricultural workers in North Carolina. I'm just going to stick with places that I know. So they're running around doing a lot of work in North Carolina. And once in a while, you see people hanging around, and you'll see lots of tiendas mexicana and so forth like that in North Carolina popping up. But I think, there is the question of what sorts of services are involved here. And these are tough jobs, right? Because if it rains a lot, if the weather's bad, you're up there, but you don't get to work in the field, and hence someone doesn't pay you to go in the field. And, but there you are, 1,500 miles from home. What? It's kind of tough, and a tough thing. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing to have workers from abroad working. I think just want to address how does it go. In North Carolina, we could address that more as, quote, conditions of, quote, guest workers and so forth. Advocacy, I think, is often not a matter of offering full-blown policies or sets of policies. I think that's important. You don't have to know the complete answer to something in order to advocate that people in positions of power pay a little bit more attention to the issues. It's critical, I think, to put poverty and poverty-related issues before the public and the body politic. This includes, I think, in part, pestering candidates. There's a pester candidates. There's a lot of good ones out there, but it's important that they be pestered, and that they be pestered once in a while by, I don't know, someone like me or you who doesn't look like, exactly they're the poor, but they want to know what's going on. So I think you should pester candidates for mayoralties, for governorships, for state houses, for Congress, and for president. Pester them to address poverty and related issues, to elaborate whatever stance and lines of attack they want to take, and whatever specific policies they favor, and not to let them get away with simply not addressing the question really at all. Once they articulate what they're for, terrific. Now it's part of a public record, and everyone can talk over whether they think it has anything to do with the price of eggs and is helpful or not. But until they articulate what it is they think they want to do, they got a free pass. And I don't think they ought to have a free pass. I know a lot of them are good people. I'm tired of giving them a free pass. The heck with that. Oh, look at this. My phone goes off while I'm delivering a lecture. We'll take care of this. I bet you it's a student. I gave him a test on Friday. So here you get this kind of thing where it's important to advocate and advocate candidates and so forth. Make sure they address it. It's not enough for candidates to say that there is a safety net for the very poor. They at least have to say what it is and be sure that we're familiar with what it is and whether or not it's adequate and why. It's not enough for a political party to say that it is the political party that has traditionally addressed poverty issues in the past. That's great. But now is now. So we would like to hear some things about it. In fact, I think when we let them get away with these sorts of remarks without addressing the issue, it is a little bit like passing by on the other side of the road, and not doing anything. So I don't have a big solution to all this, and I don't want to come up with one policy, but I do think churches, among other things, can advocate that persons in positions of responsibility at least say publicly what it is they think it is appropriate to do, and not simply let the middle class and the job creators once again become the holy grail of American politics to the extent that the poor don't get mentioned. And if the poor don't get mentioned, they're not, by us and others, they're not likely to get much mention. Because if we go back again to that golden rule stuff, who's listening to these guys? They don't really make that much difference. Donald Trump probably is not always treated fairly. He went to the University of Pennsylvania, so did I, and it's just one of those things. We weren't there at the same time. He's not my favorite public figure, but I have to admit I don't really know him. And I don't really know what his image is. The images I don't like very much. But I figure that even if good old Donald Trump isn't treated fairly part of the time, I don't really worry about it. I don't worry about it because I figure he'll get his. But he can press the stuff, and he's also got the bellicose personality to do it. So I think he'll probably be okay. But I worry about some of the others, and I think that's important. So there's a lot more that can be said. At the end of the day, we should be clear that when it comes to poverty, the responsibilities are very widely shared, and few, if any, of us come off entirely righteous. It's just not going to happen. This is not difficult to demonstrate almost anywhere, and it's especially important to say in communities of comparative means and privilege, like Davidson, North Carolina, and Davidson College, and so forth. But among other things, the ministry and teaching of Jesus in the New Testament are meant to accuse. And that's one of the classic things that was always said about the teaching of Jesus. The teaching of Jesus points positive directions. It talks about grace, but my goodness, it also accuses, and it's meant to accuse. And okay, the teachings indicate that very often the poor obtain justice only by striving against our own interests and pretensions, and no one's entirely clean in this. The other thing I want to point out again is there is grace even in the teachings of Jesus. And we want to point out how that's related to moral performance. It is not the case that your relationship with God is simply a referendum on how righteous you are. That's not so. You're welcomed home anyway. But since you're welcomed home anyway, There's no reason to dumb down the law, is there? It's not going to get you home any quicker. It's not going to. If you thought your moral performance is what got you in a relationship with God, you'd have all kinds of reason to dumb down this thing so you could appear righteous. But heck with that. You're going to be welcomed home anyway. Got no reason to boast, but you also got no reason to dumb down the law and no reason to dumb down the accusation. The teaching of Jesus contains grace. It contains moral teachings that positively guide, and it accuses. And what? Praise be to God that it also accuses, because apparently part of the time that's what people like me need, huh? And so you got it there. Okay, I'll try and answer any questions about this that I'm able. Again, it's true, my wife says I make this stuff up. Maybe that means I could almost answer anything. Yes?
Well, I'm just kind of curious, because you're the great teacher of us. Who do you learn from?
Well, there's so many great things that you can look at these days. I mean, you can go hear people lecture in different places. And, I just came here from Princeton, where there's a group working at something called the Center of Theological Inquiry on what could be called a kind of a collaborative way of going about theological reflection. So they put together seminars, and they'll have theologians in there with economists, and other people who know about different things. And the idea is that may help you adjust your theological program and stuff to some realities and maybe help with an ethic. So I'm very appreciative of opportunities like that, not simply to listen to people in theological communities, to try and reflect theologically in some of these other contexts, and I think that's good. And I think also, of course, that congregations very often are very well situated for something like that, because you're going to have people who through careers have done a variety of different things and can speak to how some things work in relationship to a theological tradition. So that's one thing I'd like to say. There are also just wonderful Bible scholars available these days writing different sorts of things. So Dominic Crossan has this big book on the historical Jesus called The Life of a Mediterranean Peasant or something like that. But he's also got a shorter one called Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography. Is that right? I think that's it. Is that it, Tom? I think. And it's short and it's extraordinarily well written. And, I don't know that I agree with him about everything, but he can sure present a compelling, zippy portrait of Jesus in there that'll bother you a little bit. It's kind of fun. He's got another one on the Lord's Prayer, I think called The Greatest Prayer. And those are pretty accessible things. And there are a whole bunch of other, if you get interested in Bible commentaries, this guy's going to be able to help you out. There's a bunch of good ones like that, I think, around. So I think I learn a lot from Bible scholars who are specialists doing that. I'm not a Bible specialist. I'm your constructive theologian. I read the Bible guys and then start making stuff up. But I need to read them to help me out, and that's a good thing. And so I think there are a lot of good things to read. And a lot of good people to talk to. So the basic answer would be there's a lot of good theological material to look at. People like Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg died recently, but I don't always agree with Marcus Borg, but I think everybody who writes is jealous of his ability to write so clearly in a nice way. If they disagree with him, they think, boy, I wish I could write like that. And it is pretty good. And there are a variety of other people writing about Jesus these days, N.T. Wright and people like that. And then there are, it's harder to get sort of more popular theology that makes much sense, which I think is unfortunate. But you could try, this is a kind of fun thing you could try to do. I don't know. There's some older stuff, it's not that old, but some of it was written by people who had mastered the declarative sentence, which is a real accomplishment for a theologian, apparently. And one of them was a guy named Walter Rauschenbusch. Now, this guy can help put you in touch with that. And he's got a book called Prayers for the Social Awakening for Openers, which has got a lot of these and thous. But I used to tell my students in seminary, it wasn't in print then, they should all go to used places and get it. It's in print now, you can get it. And they could change the these and thous and fiddle with them, and they'd have some really great social, ethical prayers, and it would look like they worked for years on them. And those are good prayers. They're worth reading to see what he's got there. And he's got some other books that are pretty easy to read. Now, there are problems with Walter Rauschenbusch. You know, he's an American progressive from the turn of the century, and he's for, quote, practical socialism, and sometimes he's got his heart on his sleeve. But he also cares about industrialization, movement of people to the cities and the poor. There are funny ways in which he still reads as a somewhat contemporary thing. There's some good things from some older characters, too, that you can read. Reinhold Niebuhr, ordinarily a little more complicated to read than Walter Rauschenbusch, but if you choose wisely, not much more. And there's a book called Love and Justice, which is occasional pieces by him. And some of those, and again, I know you got a pastor who can wind his way through this. He knows this stuff, and he'll be able to figure it out for you. And, he's got, like, for instance, there's a Reinhold Niebuhr essay that's an open letter to Billy Graham about social ethics and what he thinks of as a problem with a kind of evangelical revivalism. And he appreciates Billy Graham. There are a couple essays in there where he's arguing a little bit about Henry Ford, because Reinhold Niebuhr was a pastor here in Detroit. And there are some other things, these are old-timey things, where he's talking about, well, what are you going to do at the end of the Second World War about a United Nations or something like that? You're going to say, well, it's not perfect because it's not entirely democratic, and it's not, yeah, you bet it's not, because the only way you could get the big guys in there is to give them veto power in the Security Council. And you wanted to keep it fair enough to get some of the other literal smaller guys in there. And it works okay, and it's got all these flaws, and they're really terrible, but they're not that terrible if you can't think of a better alternative. And he'll talk about that. So Reinhold Niebuhr still works, I think, pretty well for that. Things like that. Yes, sir.
I think I read your book where you talked about Jesus having a choice when it came to the cross. I'm just curious if you could elaborate on.
A choice, I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of, a number of Bible scholars will want to try and angle up to, and also some theological ethicists, is this question of how the guy manages to get in that much trouble, right? And so the question is, how does he do it? Now, when I was coming up in Sunday school class, that was a real tough question for me to answer. I mean, I didn't even have the question when I was in Sunday school class. It was a good book, I think. It was called There Was a Man, and Jesus looked like a guy from my hometown, but here down the heroes, all basically. And he didn't look like the Jews from my hometown. He looked like, and it was a good book. It had stuff about teachings in it. But it never really was very satisfactory in terms of how would you get into trouble doing this. Now, lately, you've got some Bible scholars and others who are trying to indicate how, and they want to say that if Jesus is kind of pacifist and so forth, or nonviolent, he's a kind of nonviolent, he offers nonviolent resistance and activity that's directed at people in power part of the time. So that when he starts talking about the kingdom, this is not entirely misinterpreted as something that when you say, well, I'm a little worried what it means for my own rule. That's not an entire misinterpretation. It does mean problems. We'll talk tomorrow about him riding into Jerusalem, showing up like the king of everybody on a donkey with all the poor out there, and then riding right up to the temple and overturning the money changers. And this is the national shrine he's gone up to on the big national holiday, and he started to trash things. Now he's in trouble. And we'll see about that. So there is a respect in which you have this kind of, it's a nonviolence, but it's a kind of like Martin Luther King nonviolence. You know, you're also going to apply pressure. And so when you say a choice, well, presumably he might not have been involved in that kind of adversarial position part of the time. He might have chosen another way to do it. It's not the same thing as being able to, knowing that just what kind of trouble you're going to get in. But my guess is if you ride into town, trash the money changers in the national shrine at the biggest holiday available at the time when all the Roman garrisons are there to try and keep the crowds from becoming unruly because they've revolted before under those circumstances, you at least know that you're applying a little pressure here. And I think that kind of a choice. And I think so an interesting thing for you and me to contemplate. We don't have to do exactly the same things, but I think there is a kind of illustration of applying a little pressure part of the time, even to the point of getting in a lot of trouble. Yes, ma'am.
Could you, in terms of back to the question about your resources and
Yeah.
your teachers, would you recommend for lay people Christian Century as just being a good resource?
Sure.
Because even really, if you don't know much, you can get something.
No, Christian Century is
You know, a lot
great.
of them might get something.
Christian Century is a real nice resource, and you have articles about a number of contemporary things, and people will be reflecting theologically on them. So that'll be real important, I think. Yeah, I think so. I think there's, there's some things by some theologians who write very complicated things, but then sometimes write things that aren't as complicated, right? So one of my own teachers, a man named James Gustafson, wrote a book called The Sense for the Divine. If you're interested in stuff about a kind of religious sensibility and ecological things, he's kind of interesting there. Tom, what's the book where he's talking about Lincoln's second inaugural at the beginning? What's that one, the blue book? It's Faith and Doubt or something, or is it a reason?
Grace of self-doubt?
The Grace of Self-Doubt or something. It's got this wonderful interpretation of Lincoln's second inaugural at the beginning of the thing. Gordon Kaufman, who died about a year ago, was a theologian at Harvard, and he wrote a number of things. God, Diversity, and Hope or something is one of them. And then some other more recent ones. We've got an expert on Gordon Kaufman right here in the presbytery, Tom James, to tell you about some of those books. They're very good. Some of the Martin Luther King Jr. stuff, if you get a hold of A Testament of Hope, they are occasional essays and speeches. They've got theological content. They were delivered to a public. They're pretty easy to read, a lot of them, and they're pretty interesting. So I think you got a number of options and that are good things, you know. There's more of them than I can conveniently name right off the bat, I think. Yes.
I would, do you know of some resources that can, well, I guess I have the opinion that this doesn't work for me at all, but I once attended a church that their whole philosophy of giving was if you give, you'll get.
Uh-huh.
And it's the prosperity thing.
Yes, yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
And it's like, drives me nuts, but I'd like to actually have something to base my
Okay.
unhappiness with.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, I think that's kind of fun. So we'll start off with a couple of sympathetic remarks about good old Joel Osteen and the way he's running things down there in Houston. He seems like a nice guy. He's got a very nice-looking family. He's always well-dressed. I think part of the message is the way they appear. They appear very successful, and that's important for the message. Why does the message have traction? Well, why is it? In part because there are a lot of people in this culture who buy the idea that your worth is a matter of your economic standing and your social place in those terms, and who are not in a very good position that way, or not in the position they want to be in. And so they feel deficient in those ways. And Joel Osteen has got a gospel, the way he does it, that addresses that kind of feeling of inadequacy and difficulty. And so it has traction with a number of people, and it addresses a felt need for a lot of people. That ends the positive part of what I want to say. It addresses a real need, and he does it well. Now, unfortunately, from my point of view, the buying into commercial success as the measure of your worth is a mistake. It's a cultural mistake. American culture is very diverse, right? It's got people who listen to Beethoven and people who listen to, I don't know, Miley Cyrus. It's got people in bowling alleys and people who go to the opera. It's got people who it's a very diverse culture. Huh? So you can never say that the American culture is doing only one thing. I don't know how many cultures you can say that about, but you surely can't do it with this one. But one of the things in American culture is this idea that at a certain point, your commercial success and the choices you make, that defines meaning in life. And it is a current that he's tapping into and he knows is there, and he's managed to come up with a prosperity gospel that addresses it and makes people feel as if they can be meaningfully fulfilled in those terms. I think there is a problem here. And I'm going to just illustrate it by talking about good old Jonathan Edwards, a theologian whom I really do like. Jonathan Edwards used to have this idea that people are a little too curved in on themselves. It's an old Augustinian idea, and they're inordinately concerned about their own interests. And if you don't look out, under those circumstances, every time they see something, they're going to ask about it in relation to their own interests, see? Including their religion. And the first thing they're going to do is they're going to ask, how can God help me? And that's it. That would be the first question. It would be a little bit like, so what he wanted to say is, well, what you need to have to try and turn this business of little transformation that we see about this message of the kingdom is someone needs to come up with a sense of what he called the divine excellence. That somehow the divine is simply excellent for itself, in itself in some way. That it has and he used aesthetic language, kind of like beauty and stuff. You had to be struck by that. Now let me try and tell you what I think he means by that. I think he means like if you go to a nice museum and you see a nice impressionist painting, the first thing that you think of shouldn't be, I wonder how much it's worth. The first thing is to get there, if you're like me, and work with your glasses a little bit, and just try and take it in because it's beautiful and because it draws you out of yourself a little bit. That's not all. I'll give you another illustration because I kind of like the Cubs, but I have to admit that some years ago, the St. Louis Cardinals had the greatest shortstop I ever seen, Ozzie Smith out there. He's like an acrobat. And, you know, the Cubs are supposed to beat the Cardinals, though they never do. But he was so great out there. He's like a ballet dancer. And he would go out before the game and do backflips, right? Because he was happy to do there to warm up. And I thought, boy, I bet his agents in the stands going, please stop that. You make one of these bad backflips, how much money is it going to cost us, you know? So he's exuberant. And what I thought he did really well was, what I think sports can do really well sometimes is just a kind of gratuitous excellence. I mean, what's the meaning of a great play at shortstop, really? But it's just gratuitously excellent and terrific, and it can draw you out of yourself. That's another thing. Or like if you go see the Grand Canyon, you know, you're not supposed to go there and look and go, how can I monetize this? But you know, that is what some people do. So what Edwards wanted is that turn. And the thing is, I think good old Joel just doesn't have that turn. And since good old Joel doesn't have that turn, he's just reading it off of what Edwards would have called the difficulties of the, quote, natural person whose desires and interests are skewed and inordinate and only looks at everything in terms of how furthering their own good and problems. And that's a problem, see. And I think Edwards had a more sophisticated understanding and a more genuine understanding of what's meant when you get this stuff like, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe in the gospel. What does that mean? The kingdom of God is at hand, so here's everything behind curtain number 3? I mean, if that's what they wanted to say, they could have said that. And it doesn't. Repent, somehow change. And that's what I think Edwards has got right, and good old Joel probably doesn't have right. And so what I do in a class that I teach on Jonathan Edwards at Davidson, at the end of the class, I have them each write an essay, and one of the essays I make them write on is, I have them look at a couple of clips of Joel Osteen. It only takes a couple, really, because you can look at a whole bunch of them, and the sermons are somewhat repetitive. And I have them look at that, and they've read a whole semester reading Jonathan Edwards, and I ask them to tell me, you know, what's the same, but also what's different. And if they can't articulate what's different, then I invite them into my office. We have a little talk. See whether they actually been doing the reading in this course, because it's not the same. But I think that's right. Joel Osteen is a very impressive, articulate guy who has a certain message, but I think it's finally, myself personally, and I could always be wrong, but I think it's finally a misconstrual of the gospel, which involves at a certain point you and I being carried beyond ourselves to love God and neighbor. And last time I looked, it didn't say that Ottati should just love Ottati. I mean, if it said love of Ottati was the sum of the law, I would have been on the ground floor of this a long time ago. And I think there's something gone a little wrong. But I want to be sympathetic because the way it's gone wrong is there are a lot of people who are in difficult positions who despair of their self-worth because they've bought into this sort of your worth is a matter of your commercial success and so forth, they don't feel have it. And I think one ought to be sympathetic with that kind of, what we say, difficulty. I mean, that's a spiritual difficulty that someone's having, and that's tough. And he knows how to address it, but I'm afraid he doesn't know how to turn it and maybe help correct it, you know. Or maybe he's not interested in that, I don't know.
Okay.